Alright, bearings with Boykin. Today we're going to be doing the wheel bearing on the front passenger side of a 2014 Ford Fiesta SE. And I'm about ready to tear off into it. So first thing we're going to do is jack the vehicle up and get the wheel off. Now that we've got the wheel off, we're going to loosen the axle nut, but we're going to leave the nut on. We're just going to get it loose right now. Next step from here, we're going to remove the upper and lower brake caliper guide pin bolts, and then we're going to take off the brake caliper bracket bolts, upper and lower. There's one in the back here. Now once you got your brake caliper, your pads, and your caliper bracket off, your next step, you can go ahead and take off your axle nut, remove your rotor, and then take this ABS sensor out. Be very careful not to damage the ABS sensor. They are expensive. Now once you got your ABS sensor out, you're going to remove these three bolts right here that hold your brake dust plate on. Now the next step, you may have to have a pickle fork to do. I've got one rented, so it shouldn't be a problem. We're going to loosen this tie rod nut. We're going to take a pickle fork, leaving the nut on but loosened. We're going to pry this tie rod loose, and then we're going to remove the nut, drop the tie rod, and then we're going to take this upper and lower strut bolt out and release the steering knuckle from up here. Then we're going to take the lower ball joint nut and bolt out. And that'll give us freedom of the whole steering knuckle and hub and bearing. Now that we've got the steering knuckle out and can look down to the bearing, a few of these steering knuckles are different. Some of them you may have a circlip holding your bearing in, a little snap ring that'll go right here. In this particular steering knuckle, on the other side, behind the hub, there's a circlip. This side right here, the bearing actually stops at a lip. There's a little lip on the inside of this steering knuckle that makes the bearing stop, so it doesn't require a circlip on this side. But the other side does have a circlip. Taking the circlip out on the underside after removing the hub, which we'll do here in just a second, tells me there's a lip here keeping it from coming this way, so the bearing must be pressed out that way, going down. So now that you know about your circlips and your steering knuckle in the direction to press your bearing out, we're going to go ahead and get this hub out of the way. Guys, y'all can get this hub out whichever way works best for you. When I did the driver's side, I had it rigged up something like this. Put me a little socket there. Got me a big old hammer. Put that on top of it, and I whacked it. You may have to do that a few times till she comes on up out of there. I do see movement, so that's a good sign. She might come on out this time. And there we have it. There's your wheel bearing guts. Here's your hub. Now I want to show y'all something on this hub. Anytime you gotta hammer these hubs out, you see this metal ring right here? It's always going to be left behind. Now the fun part about that is you got to grind that booger off without damaging your hub face. From my experience, when the metal starts turning blue, It's real thin. You might want to back off of it. You don't have to cut this thing all the way through. You can actually get it pretty good and close, and heat expands. So normally it loosens up on its own and you're able to tap it off with a flathead and a hammer. But I'm gonna take you over to the table vise and grinder and see if we can get this done. Now look here, when I go to grinding this ring off this hub, y'all ain't gonna see it. Last time I done that, I melted my phone with the grinding spar. So stay tuned. Now, I've done all the dirty work with the grinder. I got it ground down, I got it broke loose, I got it almost to the end. Now I'm gonna take a flathead screwdriver and a hammer and bump it off the rest of the way. Then I'm gonna clean the hub and clean the inside of the steering knuckle after I press the bearing out, which I'll show you on the next session. Alright, y'all remember earlier when I told you there was a circlip behind the hub? This is it. It sits right there holding that bearing in. I done already took the liberty of struggling to get it out of there. So, you get your circlip out, and then you rig up. You're going to have to flip your steering knuckle over, and then we're going to rig up to press that bearing out. Now that we've got the bearing pressed out, I can show you the lip. Right there at the tip of my knife, there's a lip that runs all the way around that catches that bearing. That's why there's not a circlip on that side. And be advised, your bearing will not press out in that direction. Okay? Alright, so the bearing now has to be pressed in from the top here. But on these bearings, be mindful. One side has an ABS sensor track. It will be the magnetic side, or the brown side, or possibly orange side. That side, the brown and orange side, or whichever side's magnetic of your bearing, must go in first. The other face will be up here. The side that reads the ABS sensor comes out of that hole right there. So that ABS sensor track needs to be on the bottom side. Alright, now we're going to get the bearing out of the freezer, and the reason we put it in the deep freeze is to facilitate the press of the bearing. Metal somewhat contracts just a hair, enough to make it a little easier when it's ice cold than it will be if it's hot when it's expanded. So I'll rig up and press this bearing in and show you how it's done. Now, I done went ahead and took the liberty of putting the old circlip back in. I put the wheel hub in the deep freeze to facilitate the pressing into the bearing here. And that's going to be our next step. But I want to go over something with y'all on that. When you go to pressing this wheel hub into this bearing, if you don't have this bearing, that plate backed up on the back side of this bearing, for instance, if you put your backup plate here on the steering knuckle and not up against the bearing, when you go to pulling that hub down through the top, through the inside of that bearing, you're going to pull the guts of your bearing out. make sure that your backup plate is up against the bearing for this next step. Alright, fixing to press the hub into the bearing. Now, once you got your hub pressed into your bearing, and you haven't gutted your bearing, and everything's good and in working order, you then start working in reverse until the job is complete. This concludes today's episodes of Bearings with Boykin. And remember, if you can't fix it, call a Boykin.